We left off with using our patterns to be able to quickly identify the notes G, B, and D anywhere on the guitar neck. We're going to learn to identify the remaining notes in our scale, A, C, E, and F sharp, and then we're going to start to move beyond scales just a little bit with triads and arpeggios. To find our A, we find pattern 1 going into pattern 3, and our A is the first note in this sequence. Another way to identify this is by first finding our D, which is 3 pattern 3s in a row, and then we know the pattern that comes just before that first pattern 3 is a pattern 1, and that starts with our A. To find our C, we find pattern 3 going into pattern 2, and our C is the first note in that sequence. We can also find our C by first finding our G by finding pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2, and then our C is the same pattern 3, pattern 2 from those upper 2 strings. To find our E, we just have to find 2 pattern 1s, and the E is the first note in that sequence. An alternate way to find our E is by first finding our B by finding where we have pattern 2 going into pattern 1. These are the 2 different whole step, half step patterns right next to each other, and the E is the first note of pattern 1 from that sequence. This leaves us with one last note to identify, and to find our F sharp, we just have to find 2 pattern 2s next to each other, and it's the first note in that sequence again. The F sharp is also a half step below the first note we identified, which is G. One last way to find our F sharp is by first identifying our G pattern again, and the F sharp is the first note in the last line of this pattern. This pattern 2 is always followed by another pattern 2. Something you may have started to notice is how all these patterns overlap and relate to each other. Our easy patterns always repeat in the same order. The simplest way to remember it is we have 3 pattern 3s, then we have 2 pattern 2s, and then we have 2 pattern 1s, and then it starts over again. There are also 7 notes on our scale, and each note corresponds to the starting note in those 7 patterns, not in scale order though. You can see this a little easier when it's laid out on a 7 string in standard tuning. Pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2, pattern 2, pattern 1, pattern 1. At this point, we've used our 3 easy patterns to be able to memorize where all the notes are on the neck in the key of G. And we've also been able to use them to identify the note names themselves. We are going to go over how we can move into other scales and key signatures, but there are some useful topics beyond scales that'll be easier to cover in our current key signature first. Let's see how we can mutate our 3 easy patterns to be able to identify major, minor, and diminished triads or arpeggios. And a triad is just a 3-note chord. Let's start with the 3 notes that we learned in the last video: G, B, and D. These notes together form a G major triad. This triad is called a diatonic triad because it comes from our diatonic scales, which are the 7-note scales we've already been learning. We construct this triad by using our scales and skipping until we have 3 unique notes. Given that the notes in our G major scale are G, A, B, C, D, E, and F sharp, by skipping notes, this lets us figure out that the notes in our G major triad are G, B, and D. We can also refer to these as the root or first, third, and fifth of the scale. And the same terminology is used when we're referring to chords. We call it the root of the chord, the third of the chord, and the fifth of the chord. This is very common terminology, so it is important to be aware of this. Now, what would it look like if we played this triad 1 note at a time as an arpeggio, starting with our G in our root position? We play the G with our index, the B with our pinky, and then the D with our middle finger. We can look at this 2 ways. We can either say we're playing the first and third notes from the first pattern and the second note from the second pattern, or we can take our pattern 3 and mutate its shape so that that middle note is moved over a string. This pattern is going to be the same everywhere on the guitar neck, except when we're playing on the G and the B string. This shifts the note on the B string up a half step. If you're remembering the shape for the triad by taking the first and third notes of the first pattern and the second note of the second pattern, you don't need to make any changes on the G and the B string and you'll still arrive at the correct shape. But if you're mutating pattern 3 to get this triad, then you do need to shift the note on the B string up a half step to get the correct shape. This shape is a little easier to play by replacing your middle finger with your ring finger on the B string. If we move up to our next chunk of scales, we're starting with our A. And from here, if we skip notes in the scale again, we get A, C, and E. This is an A minor triad. If we play through this arpeggio, we would again play the first and third notes of the first pattern and the second note of the second pattern. The other way we can get this shape is by mutating our pattern 1. If we move the middle note over a string, this shape now matches our triad arpeggio shape as well. We again need to make a modification on the G and the B strings, and for this, it's a little easier to bar with our pinky. So by mutating pattern 3, we get our major shape, and by mutating pattern 1, we get our minor shape. In the last video, we very briefly discussed intervals and how they relate to our scales. We said while both of these intervals are called thirds, one is major and one is minor. 2 whole steps in a row make our interval a major third, while a whole step and a half step in either order gives us a minor third. In a similar fashion, a half step is called a minor second and a whole step is called a major second. A nice way to help remember some of this is major intervals are always a half step larger than their minor counterparts, and minor intervals are always a half step smaller than their major counterparts. Since all of our scales right now are made up of whole steps and half steps, we can use this to know that the minor second is the smaller of those 2 intervals. The only other interval we're going to worry about right now are fifths. In our major and minor triads, the fifth of the chord is the same interval and is what we call a perfect fifth. The terms major and minor are not used for fifths. This means our major triad is root, a major third, and then a perfect fifth. And our minor triad is root, a minor third, and then a perfect fifth. As an added bonus for our major triad, the interval between the third and the fifth, which is our B and our D, is a minor third. So stacking a minor third on top of a major third gives us our perfect fifth interval. And we have a really nice symmetry with our minor triad. The interval between the third and the fifth, our C and our E, is a major third. So stacking a major third on top of a minor third again gives us a perfect fifth. So to get a major triad, we stack a minor third on top of a major third. And to get a minor triad, we stack a major third on top of a minor third. You can visualize this nicely on one string with a G major triad. And then by lowering the middle note a half step, we make this a minor third and a minor triad. You can see that the middle note moves, but the upper note is the same. This brings us to our last triad today, the diminished triad. We get it by stacking two minor thirds on top of each other, and our fifth is no longer perfect, it's now a diminished fifth. Although this interval is more commonly referred to as a tritone. Another term for whole steps and half steps are tones and semitones, and there are three whole steps or tones between the two notes, thus the term tritone. If we look at the notes F sharp, A, and C, they make a diminished triad. Again, if we play this arpeggio, we would play the first and third notes of the first pattern and the second note of the second pattern. We can again get this shape by mutating our last easy pattern, pattern 2. If we move the middle note up a string, this shape now matches as well. This is a good stopping point for now. There are still 4 more triads that we need to look at and identify whether they're a major, minor, or diminished, but that'll be a little easier after we spend some time digesting this information first. For the next lesson, we'll finish identifying the remaining triads. We are currently playing our triads as arpeggios, but we'll learn how to rearrange those notes on the neck so they can all be played at the same time as a chord. We'll also dive deeper into intervals, and if I can squeeze it in, we'll also talk about how we can start to modify patterns into other keys. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.